rainwater is the most precious thing that we have. And, that it is absolutely fundamental to the way a water company works. And so we have got to really treasure and value every drop that falls, collect it, protect it, and ensure that we've got resilient catchments so that we can deal with the vagaries of climate change.
Joe, welcome to the Rebalancers podcast. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Of course. So I'm Jo Harrison. I'm the Strategic Planning Director at United Utilities. So my job is to really look at all the way in which we do future planning in the water industry, and particularly for the customers of the North West. So how we look at things like climate change, the challenge of reducing our carbon footprint, the growing population that we have in the North West of England, but also changing environmental regulation as well. And so how we put all of those things in the mix to make sure that we can deliver resilient water services for customers into the future.
That sounds like a very big job, and I can't wait to unpack a lot of that together. But obviously, you've joined United Utilities 26 years ago, and I'm curious to see how things have changed since you were a graduate, and what first sparked your passion for water management?
So if I start with what sparked my passion for water management. So my background is I sort of did environmental science degrees, and I worked for a little while in the renewable energy industry, and then really decided that I wanted to sort of go back to water. And I say go back to water because my family have all worked in the water industry. So my grandfather and my dad were both, sort of their whole careers were in the water industry. So I sort of started my life doing university jobs at Severn Trent Water, which serves the Midlands. So it was an area that I obviously knew really well and has sort of grown up in. And that's really what sort of attracted me back to the industry. But I joined in 1998, which was only 8 years really since privatisation of the industry. But not a great deal has really changed since those times. Water companies are smaller organisations now, far fewer people, and obviously much more automated and reliant on data. But fundamentally, we look at what the government is asking us to do, we process that, we understand what the natural environment needs, and we deliver infrastructure for the future.
Obviously, I understand you're saying there hasn't been major change, but there must have been some level of change that you've witnessed. And I'm guessing perhaps climate change has played a role in how have water utilities approached this kind of environmental change that's kind of hit them.
Yeah, so I think, sort of looking sort of backwards and maybe what it was sort of like 26 years ago, I think there was an element of, water companies and probably society more generally was probably just sort of more subservient and got on and sort of did a job and wasn't necessarily challenged externally. And I think what we've probably sort of seen, particularly over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, is very significant impacts from a changing climate, huge growth in terms of sort of the population growth of the region, and just the most important thing, I think, is changing expectations from customers. So, water was always a little bit of a silent service. I think the pandemic really changed the way people value the natural environment, the way they want to spend time in the natural environment. And that, coupled with Brexit, meant that water became something that we were talking about as a part of a national agenda. And people were worried that actually, moving out of Europe would change the government's approach to how we invest and improve in water. And so it started to sort of, it really increased from there, how actually that's sort of gone up the agenda and is now really sort of critical part of news and is part of people's changing expectations.
And do you think people are making the connection between the water that they experience at home, from their tap, and the general water environment? Are they making this connection?
I don't think they are quite yet. Obviously some people are, and some people are really informed. But I think, one of the things that we find when we have periods of dry weather and we ask customers to conserve water and use water wisely, it's hard for them to necessarily understand that the water coming through their tap is being taken from the natural environment somewhere. And so that's a link we try and make, sort of to take them back to, the lakes in the Lake District or in the Pennines or around our region where, actually that water is coming from.
And that's the interesting thing because, you mentioned the Lake District. A lot of the water from Manchester is actually coming quite far away. And I guess that makes it harder also for the consumer to be able to make that link that it's coming from that area. And if it starts getting too low, it has an impact.
Oh yes, at least half the water for Greater Manchester comes from the Lake District, and that's really a result of fantastic engineering in Victorian times, 100 years ago and more. But it does, make a difference really that actually Manchester as a city isn't sustainable in terms of its own water sources from its own reservoirs, so we have to import across the region.
And I think coming back to your point you were saying earlier on, population grows, and if we take a city like Manchester, it is a growing city, it's a dynamic city, but it is also a city which, like most cities, I would say, across the UK, is going through this transformation where digitization is becoming increasingly important. We're looking at more usage of data centers. There is increasing energy needs as we're electrifying our transportation, and I always associate energy with water. They're very closely associated. So how as a water utility do you balance supporting the growth of a city like Manchester, which is becoming more water dependent, and having to get water further afield? How do you find that balance and the environment at the same state?
And it's a really interesting question because I think we're seeing change at a pace that we've never seen it before. So all water companies have to plan for water use long into the future. Every 5 years, we have to produce a plan that looks at the next 100 years and what are we going to do. But that's fine when you're looking at sort of population and domestic growth or traditional industries. We're very experienced at planning for those. But what's different now is these very fast-paced changes around the hydrogen economy, around data centres, around battery storage. All of those need water in different forms. And, we're trying to ensure that we're at the heart of that decision-making, that we're helping those industries to be enabled and to enable that growth to happen within the city. But I think the critical thing is actually sort of if we work with those organisations, really trying to understand exactly what their need is, because people often think that they need potable water. But really, if you're using water for cooling or you're using water for hydrogen production, you don't need to have potable water. We could actually do something different and innovative, either with water taken directly from the natural environment, or we could do something with our effluent from our treatment works. So actually looking at grey water and non-potable water and being innovative about the way of thinking is really what we're trying to drive.
Yeah, and I think that leads on nicely to my next question, which is, you have to be able to do this planning, as you said, up to 100 years. But to do this planning, you need to be able to coordinate it with, the local bodies, right? Whether it's, in the case of Manchester, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, GMCA, or with the EA. Is that part of the reason there was this impetus to look at building the Integrated Water Management Plan? And perhaps you could tell our audience a little bit about that plan and what role does UU play in it?
Yeah, so if we look at sort of the normal regulatory and governance environment within a city, then you really do have silos with different organisations. So the Environment Agency looks at water sustainability generally, but then they look at flooding associated with rivers. Local authorities manage flooding associated with surface water, and they manage the small streams and culverts and brooks, which they call ordinary watercourses. And then water companies manage the sewers. And of course, all of those things are absolutely interconnected. Yeah. And so if we operate in silos, we can't make progress because you can't think and plan and invest just to deal with those that are under your particular jurisdiction. So what we've done in Greater Manchester is just try and think a little bit differently. We've had quite a long history of working very collaboratively in Greater Manchester. We've had some projects that have been funded by the European Union. One was called Natural Course, which enabled the organisations to come together. And one of the things we've just tried to do is take off the shackles of our organisations to work differently, to co-locate and to think much more creatively about how we manage water quantity, water quality and water resources all together and holistically. And I think it's actually, that enables us to think really differently. So that's what we're sort of calling our approach to water management in the city. We're calling it an integrated water management plan, which balances off all of those different requirements and utilises all of those different regulatory bodies, but also builds consensus with some of the environmental organisations as well.
Perfect. Now, regulatory bodies. So I want to switch gears now and move towards Ofwat, who is the water regulator. Now, PR24 mandates, is probably one of the biggest overhaul that's come up. So PR24, for those who don't know, it stands for price review. And I'm curious to know, from a United Utilities perspective, how was PR24 received? And what has been the implications of the targets that it sets with regards to nature-based solutions? And so what I'd love for you perhaps to tell our audience is a little bit of information about what is PR24, what are the implications for United Utilities, and what role does nature-based solutions play within that, especially with regards to traditional investments, let's say, or infrastructure?
Okay. Yeah. So in the water industry, we set a business plan every 5 years, and we work with our regulators and we define the scope of the investment within that 5-year period. And that then informs customer bills. And so that's the sort of the regulatory mechanism that we go through. And a lot of our investment is driven by environmental regulation. In fact, the majority of it is driven by environmental regulation. And I mentioned before about the sort of the changing climate externally, and one of the results of that was a new piece of legislation called the Environment Act. And that has really driven very much more stringent requirements in terms of the way that water companies invest. And so we are investing in huge amount to do with reducing the amount of spills that come from our combined sewer overflows, but also the level of treatment at our treatment works. And so companies are seeing the level of environmental investment increasing 2 or 3 times. So PR24, this price review, which sets prices from 2025 to 2030, is the biggest investment period that the water industry has had since privatisation. So this is an absolutely phenomenal opportunity for the industry to really reset the way that we think about our drainage and our sewerage systems and really invest to make a very significant step change. So one of the things that we're trying to do is to balance traditional engineering investment with using nature-based solutions. So looking at how we just manage water in a different way. And I suppose the sewer overflow question is one of those good examples to explain that. So our sewers they're not hermetically sealed.
Yes.
Anybody has the right to connect to a sewer, but with that brings a lot of surface water. And so one of the reasons our overflows spill is that they're becoming overwhelmed with surface water. So the whole water industry is looking at how do we take surface water out of our sewers, and therefore making sure that they're doing their job, which is to convey sewage, and that we're managing rainwater differently within the natural environment. And being able to use nature-based solutions to do that is just critical. And so we're using sort of techniques that we call sustainable drainage to hold water in the natural environment. And of course, it creates great places for nature and great places for people to enjoy as well.
And do you find that having this kind of push coming in from Ofwat is one that helps convince people throughout the organization to embrace nature-based solutions? Because I've had conversations with a number of water utilities, and you always have this kind of push-pull regarding nature-based solutions. You have people who believe in hard engineering and who will stick to that. It's man-made. We believe in man-made solutions. Nature-based solutions is this nice green, blue stuff. How do we measure it? How does it stack up to traditional infrastructure? how has that been received internally within United Utilities? Because you have done a number of projects which we'll discuss about in a little while. But has that been a cultural shift, or is that something you're still on that journey?
We are definitely still on that journey. So, I think the water industry is set up with a relationship with the supply chain that's largely with big engineering companies. And engineers like to be able to know that the solution that they're delivering is going to work. But also so do our regulators.
Yeah.
So one of the challenges that we've got at the moment is that for every project we need to deliver, we've got quite short timescales, and we're going to be regulated in a very specific way. And so it does drive, unfortunately, a tendency to revert to civil engineering solutions. So we have to be quite prescriptive where we want to embrace nature-based solutions. We have to work really closely with regulators. Ofwat is very, very supportive of that shift. And we need to work closely with the Environment Agency too, who are potentially a little bit more anxious about making sure that actually those solutions are really going to deliver the outcome that they want to see in terms of environmental improvements. So I think we're definitely on a journey. I think it's a journey that is easier when we're talking about flooding and water quantity. I think it's harder when we're talking about actually making quality improvements. So using nature instead of technology to drive improvements in water quality. That is a more difficult regulatory conversation, but one that we're working through as hard as we can.
But I imagine that water quality is impacted by the types of flooding that it impacts, and also equally droughts. As the level of water reduces, the percentage of that water that is potentially, polluted or so on, it increases. So do you see it how this all is interconnected to water quality between the flooding and the drought?
Absolutely. So we sort of really seeing that as the climate changes, the temperature of water is increasing.
Yeah.
We've seen a 1 degree increase in the temperature of water in our reservoirs over the last 10 years. So when water is warmer, it becomes more vulnerable in terms of the ecology that it supports, and the impacts from contamination or from sewage discharges become even more enhanced. So, actually sort of looking at how you manage the whole sort of quantity of water in the river system, the temperature of it, there are all opportunities to explore nature-based solutions and how we can make the whole system more resilient. I think where regulators are more worried is where they've asked us to do something very specific at a treatment works to improve the level of nutrient removal, as an example.
Yeah.
And that's where they're getting nervous about the use of natural systems rather than concrete or traditional technology.
So that's going to bring us very nicely into one of your projects. And I'd like for you perhaps to introduce us to the River Petteril project. What was that about? What was its objective? And how did you tackle it with regards to NBS? And did you do it on your own, or did you do it with a number of other stakeholders?
So the River Petteril is in the Lake District, so it's a tributary of the River Eden, which is an absolutely fabulous river that flows through Carlisle, and is a special area of conservation. It's well known for its salmon, and it also is very vulnerable to flooding. But in the Petteril catchment, which is upstream from that, we had a regulatory obligation to deliver some increased phosphorus removal from some small treatment works. But the traditional technology would be very high energy, so we would need to install high voltage power. We would also need to sort of provide chemical treatment to that wastewater, and that would involve tanker loads of chemicals coming. And so we're talking about very small treatment works in small rural catchments. And we thought that actually, I think, that this can be something better that we do here, that you could use biological systems or intervene within the catchments to do something different to actually manage the level of phosphorus at those treatment works. So we set about trying to better understand what was going on in the catchment. Information that's held by the Environment Agency and other organisations is often not very up to date.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really give a great picture of what the dynamics are within a catchment. So we undertook some work working with the University of Lancaster and some consultants to actually get a better picture of what was happening within that catchment. And that really revealed that the sources of pollution weren't necessarily our treatment works, and they weren't necessarily coming from where we thought they were. But it did identify a need for us to invest in some locations. So we set about building a sort of catchment plan for the area, looking at how we could work with agriculture, which was the primary source of the phosphorus within the catchment, to actually deliver interventions that would be cheaper, quicker to deliver, more effective and more sustainable in the long term, and really focusing on reducing the carbon footprint of what we were doing in the interventions in that area. So we worked with the Rivers Trust, who are a brilliant charity who work very closely with through all river catchments in the UK and beyond, and to look at how they could deliver interventions with farmers in that geography. So we got lots of farmers on board. We looked at how we could actually put very simple interventions in place to fence off watercourses, to cover middens where they would keep silage and slurry, and look at where the animals would sort of walk and traverse around the farms, and so really it was to look at all the opportunities to minimise runoff from those farms, and we delivered lots of interventions. And we also delivered some nature-based solutions at our own treatment works, where we could deliver low-tech solutions to meet more relaxed permits, but obviously in a much more sustainable way. And it's delivered a huge amount of benefit, and the level of phosphorus reduction is far exceeded the regulatory requirements, and it's also sort of kick-started other activity within the catchment. So as we were working with the farmers, we identified that Nestlé were also working with the farmers. So it's very much a dairy farming area, and a lot of the dairy farmers sell their milk through different organisations, but ultimately to Nestlé, who've got a factory in a place called Dalston in Carlisle, and they make powdered milk at that factory. And so they need very high nutrient content milk in order to be able to make powdered milk from it. So they're really interested in making sure that the grassland that the cows that are providing that milk are feeding from is as rich and as full as nutrients as possibly can be. So they were starting to work with farmers to incentivise them to also deliver the types of measures that we were looking at as well. So we came together and we created an ecosystem market where we were buying and selling services with farmers to basically incentivise them to have best management practices across their land. And it's been an incredible journey. We've learned a lot. We're continuing to develop that by trying to sort of sustain that ecosystem market, look at how we can work with others to ensure that is retained within that space. But it's also critical that we've been working with regulators as well. Because this means everybody taking a leap of faith and regulators changing the way that they think about obligations and they think about how we're actually going to drive improvements within catchment areas.
I love how you explain it, because in a handful of minutes, you explained it, you made it sound so simple. But I think we both know how complicated these kind of projects are. And I just want to double click a little bit by going a bit backwards. I think it started in 2019, this project. So when this project was looked at, what was the click that happened in the mindsets to say there must be a better way of doing this? Because, you correctly identified as energy costs, there are chemical costs, and especially, that's happened after 2019 with inflation and was during the COVID, cost of energy has shot up. Is that what made you think about, as United Utilities, to look at this differently? And how did you manage to convince the relevant internal stakeholders to take that leap of faith, to go and explore perhaps an alternative solution? If you could take us back to that period of time, and how did you guys make that assessment that, yes, we should take that leap of faith? And then I want to talk about the actual project itself, because you talked about farmers, you need a certain type of culture, to be able to communicate with farmers. There's sometimes trust issues. Sometimes you have to work with them individually. Sometimes, there is, they work within a cooperative of some sort. Yeah, so if you could perhaps go into some of those details, that would be great if possible.
Yeah. So I suppose starting with the first bit about the sort of the leap of faith
Yes.
and looking at the problem. So at United Utilities, we are one of the biggest landowners within the UK. So we have 56,000 hectares of land that we manage to protect our water supplies. And as part of our management of that land, we have been sort of looking at nature-based solutions for a long time. So we've probably got more history than other water companies of thinking about how we protect water quality for drinking by restoring catchments and looking at nature. And so there's sort of, I suppose there was a bit of a history and a level of expertise within the company that it sort of gave us a bit of confidence that actually nature's really powerful, and you can do things quite quickly and quite easily that makes a big difference. And so I suppose that was a sort of backdrop. And then when we looked at the sort of Petteril catchment, the treatment works within that catchment were really small. Then they are serving small communities, smaller than a village. They're hamlets, they're collections of farms. And so they're very, very small treatment works, which often don't have any power to them. So they are entirely operating under gravity. They are entirely biological systems. So they're really sustainable. And it just seemed a huge shame to turn these wonderful small treatment works that were, in effect, environmentally benign into something that required high voltage power, that involved, tanker loads of chemicals coming every day, to solve one problem but create another. And so it really felt that actually we had a sort of responsibility to look at how to retain that sustainable angle with these treatment works. And I think we were also sort of convinced that they were so small and the catchment was so big that there must be other things happening in that catchment. And I talked earlier about the Natural Course project we had in Greater Manchester. And that, although it was focused in Greater Manchester, also looked more broadly than that and looked beyond Manchester's boundaries across the northwest. And it gave us a legitimacy with the regulators to think outside the box and to be innovative and to think differently. So we had some great people who were working at the Environment Agency at the time who've now retired, but they were innovators and they thought differently. And so when we sort of went to them with the proposition that we could do something different in this catchment, I think they felt that we'd got the legitimacy to be able to do that. And I think that's quite important because innovation is not always the natural sort of home of a regulator. And so it was really important that we had that sort of trusting relationship and we had the backdrop that we could innovate against.
And how did you find working with landowners such as farmers? I mean, again, it's about getting them to change certain practices. Is it about how did you get them to align with, I guess, the vision you're trying to do? Or is it just a question of, we'll pay you X amount and that's it? But our suspicious feeling is not.
I think, water companies are not popular at the moment, but, we're always have been seen as a corporate entity.
Yeah.
And, in a place like the Northwest, farmers in the Lake District would also sort of see us as, those people down in Manchester or whatever. So we need to think differently about how we work with people like that. And we're great partners with the Rivers Trust. They're a brilliant charity. And the Rivers Trust work every day with stakeholders along river corridors. And every Rivers Trust is really sort of based in the catchment in which they operate. So we worked really closely with the Eden Rivers Trust. So they are working every day with the landowners and the farmers and the organisations who rely on the River Eden and are sort of operating along its banks. And so we really we engaged the Eden's Rivers Trust to be our eyes and ears and our deliverer on the ground. And that really worked because they had established relationships and they had already had similar types of projects within the catchment that they could draw on. But a lot of it is around showing and telling and getting the first farmers to adopt it and actually see that it can be implemented in a way that doesn't impact their business. In fact, it helps it. And then once you sort of get those farming advocates, then the conversations down the pub help with that and help it sort of proliferate. And we also found one of the interesting things that I remember learning from the Rivers Trust was if you engage some of the advocates in an area, then it can really help spread the word. So one of the things that they pointed to were the vets that operate.
Okay.
So if the vets are going from farm to farm, or land agents might be the same. So you've got people who farmers and the agricultural community rely on and trust. If they start being your advocates, then that can also really help you. And that was one of the things that happened in the catchment.
That's what I love about those kind of place-based kind of investments is that you have to work with the local communities. You have to be there. It's not something you can do from a distance in Manchester or in our case in London. You have to go on the ground and, earn credibility. It's funny. It reminds me one of the little nuggets of advice I was given is when we go to a location, make sure that you're not wearing brand new wellies. Yeah. That your wellies have been worn and used, or else you're just going to be seen as one of those Londoners coming in with your shining pair of wellies. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
I want to switch now to another project you've done, which is the Wyre NFM pilot. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? Because that was quite, an innovative project that's been quoted in the press many times, and lots of papers have been written about it. So, could you tell our audience a little bit about this project, what got it started, and what was its aim?
So I suppose a little bit of background, I suppose. I think one of the things I was sort of convinced of was that every time we see sort of very significant flooding incidents, and for me that's across the northwest, there's always sort of part of you that sort of thinks we must be able to do things differently. And I was sort of particularly sort of drawn to the fact that it must cost the insurance industry so much to be able to insure homes. And surely there would be a way in which they have a vested interest to actually help us act and help stop reducing flooding. So in Greater Manchester, we have cooperative insurance based here. So we set up a meeting with the co-op and tried to sort of explore that idea that actually we could work together to think differently about flooding in a particular area. And at the time when I started thinking about it, I was focusing on Carlisle, so the same catchment as the Petteril, because that catchment really does suffer from flooding. But we quickly sort of realised that was really a very big area. I mean, Carlisle's a city. It's probably too big an area to tackle in the first instance. So we tried to think about different areas where they particularly suffered from flooding. And we identified the community of Churchtown, which is in the Wyre catchment, which is outside Blackpool. And it was one of those sort of interesting examples of how regulatory organisations work in silos and don't help people and don't help communities. So Churchtown is a sort of small village, and it often floods. And it floods from a combination of surface water runoff, river flooding, and the sewers also get inundated. But when you look at the local authority, or you look at the Environment Agency, or you look at United Utilities, neither of the situations were so severe that the companies or organisations would ever invest to solve the problem, because they always had places that were worse off. And that would, leave this sort of community never getting a fix, never getting a solution. So we thought that might be a good place to start. And so we looked at actually, if we sort of combine our thinking and look at the sort of the joint impacts of the flooding, then we could do something differently. And actually, because this was a rural community, we could really look upstream and look up into the catchment and look at how we could hold water back in the catchment. And it really sort of lent itself to looking at nature-based solutions and natural flood management within the catchment. And so by this sort of time, we'd really got the Rivers Trust on board, and the Rivers Trust really started to take a lead on what we could do in that catchment, and started to really drive some innovation. So we looked at the same sort of philosophy as with the Petteril. So we looked at creating a nature-based market, an ecosystem market, and trying to bring this buyers and sellers of those ecosystem services together. And the Wyre Rivers Trust worked tirelessly really with the farmers and the agricultural community to look at locations where we could install nature-based solutions. And they also looked at how we could form a community investment company to raise the capital to deliver the money for the interventions that we needed to put in place, and then set up the financial mechanisms by which ourselves, the Environment Agency, Flood Re, who are the reinsurers, and the local authority could then pay over time for the benefits that are being delivered by that investment. So we did a lot of work with the Esme Fairbairn Foundation and with Triodos Bank to look at innovative funding mechanisms and ways in which we could drive the capital investment. And then we're all now paying a sort of an ongoing operational cost around the benefit that's delivering for flood management. So again, it's sort of a real creation of environmental market and a different way of doing things, which hopefully is driving some benefit.
And how long do you think this project is going to last? So you're making those payments, over a period of time. What do you expect when that period of time comes to an end is the final outcome and what that translates to those communities, which, as you say, the problem was not big enough for them to be prioritized. If you could talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, so I think, we're identifying these new ways of working, aren't we, and developing them and evolving them all the time. But I suppose the sort of position that we've got at the moment is that by the time it comes to the end of the payment scheme, that actually those nature-based solutions will be permanently established within the natural environment, and will be taking care of themselves. And so actually the benefit will be embedded in the way that the catchment is working from that point on. But I suppose there's lots of learning, isn't there? So, if that's not the case, we'll need to think again about how we sort of continue to invest in maybe new solutions or additional ones, and how to sort of continually evolve that market.
And has the local community seen a drop in the flooding impacts or from those interventions?
Yes, so we're working closely with academia at Lancaster University again to look at the benefit that's being delivered from those schemes, and yes, seeing benefit all the time. And I think it always strikes me that actually the benefit comes quickly. Nature does sort of take hold quite quickly to drive.
So when you say quickly, let's put some numbers around that, because let's say I build a wall. It takes me X amount of time to build that wall to protect my home, my community from flooding. I do a nature-based solution. It's quickly. Can you give us an idea of comparison in terms of speed, or?
I think it's
is that the wrong kind of comparison to do?
It's probably quite difficult to do because it's not an exact science.
Yeah.
But I suppose what we saw in the Petteril catchment was that actually the phosphorus reduction really happened even within the first year. So people sometimes talk about nature-based solutions taking a long time to get established.
Yeah.
But actually, I think there's quite a lot that we can do quite quickly.
Yeah.
In order to see that benefit. So we're certainly seeing in both the Wyre and the Petteril that it's within the first year you start to see the benefit.
Yeah.
It might not be immediate like with a wall, but it isn't tens of years.
Yes.
It happens relatively quickly.
Exactly. Now, with regards to the learnings from the Wyre catchment work and looking at the recent floods that happened in Manchester over New Year's, is there perhaps some learnings from the Wyre that you think if only we had applied them at a catchment level, to protect Manchester, could things have been different in terms of the outcomes?
Well, I think they are on such different scales.
Yeah.
In the Wyre, we're talking about a community of less than 10,000 people. In Greater Manchester, you've got 3 million people. It's a huge city, and it's a city that sits in a topographical bowl. It's got the Pennine Hills around sort of, 3/4 of the city. But the philosophy is the same.
Yeah.
If actually, all the rivers that impact Greater Manchester start in the Pennines, and the Pennines really suffered in terms of peatland erosion during the Industrial Revolution. And so lots of organisations have been looking at how we can restore peatland, how we can create much more resilient uplands, but we're not there yet. And there's still a huge opportunity to deliver resilience through biodiversity restoration, peatland restoration, really thinking about natural flood management in the Pennines that could really protect Greater Manchester. And so that's something that's really going to be a sort of fundamental pillar of the work that we need to do around the integrated water management plan for the city. It's around thinking, how do you start right up at the top of the catchments? And, it makes good business sense too. So, not all the water that supplies Greater Manchester comes from the city, but some of it does. And I heard a sort of a stat once, and I don't know how based in science this is, but somebody once told me that if we restored all the peat around Greater Manchester, we could store as much water in the peat as we do already in our reservoirs. And so I think that's a sort of a thing that we've got to hold on to, that, to be able to survive and deliver resilient services in a changing climate, we've got to be able to just be able to sort of respond to those big fluxes that we're going to see.
Yeah.
And we need to store more water, and to take account of how dry potentially our summers are going to become.
But how do you think we're going to get there? How do you think we're going to get from, a Wyre catchment, as you said, 10,000 people, to Manchester 3 million? There's probably going to be some steps in between. What is that journey? If you were able to predict what that journey looks like, or what would you like it to be? Can you show us a yellow brick road path to that?
Well, I think it's really important that you cut the elephant up to eat it, isn't it? We can't do it all at once.
Yes.
But we can do it in bite-sized chunks. And so I think it's sort of understanding where we're at individual opportunities. So one of the things and the great outcomes from the price review that we've got is that we've got a sort of a piece of investment that we're going to be delivering called the Advanced WINEP. And that's a technical acronym, but it stands for an Advanced Water Industry Natural Environment Plan. And it's essentially some money that allows us to really invest in green solutions within Greater Manchester to manage water. And the idea is to offset the need for more capital and grey infrastructure investment in AMP9 in the 2030 to 2035 period. And so we've got £250 million to spend on natural flood management, surface water separation, rainwater management within the city, and that is an extraordinary opportunity. So we want to look at how can we deliver that in different ways in different locations. So that might be by developing really, really great integrated water management plans at a sort of specific geography level. So building on the Wyre, trying to scale that up. And so we're trying to do that in Wigan in particular. Mm-hmm. So we saw a lot of flooding in a place called Hindley, which is part of the Wigan catchment. So we're going to look at how we can work differently with regulators there and organisations there to be able to deliver natural flood management. But also in Bolton and in Oldham, where we know that there's lots and lots of opportunity to do more in the catchment to deliver natural flood management. But we'll be working across the city too. So we'll be working with all of the other infrastructure providers, with Transport for Greater Manchester, thinking about how when they invest and they're doing things to dig up the streets and change the way that the urban realm is sort of organised, what can we do to manage water differently in that context? So all of that is going to come together. But, it will be a long journey.
Yeah.
But I particularly hold on to the fact that I just think there is a way to manage water in a better way in the Peak District, that to protect the city. If we can protect the upstream catchments, then that takes care of the downstream catchments.
Completely.
And, some of that land is owned by us as the water company. Some of the land is privately owned. Some of the land is with organisations like the National Trust. So we're trying to sort of work with stakeholders and partners to look at how we can proliferate that really great practice across the Pennines.
And I guess one of the challenges that you must face, and I know even if you do Google search or just talk to a number of different stakeholders, there is this nearly philosophical view that it's either green or it's grey. And there is, thankfully, a realization that it should probably be a hybrid where green can actually safeguard or increase the longevity of grey infrastructure. And I guess I'd like to get an understanding, where does United Utilities stand on that spectrum?
I think that's absolutely how it needs to be. So I think what we're probably going to see in the next 5 years is more grey than we would like, because actually we've got an immediate problem that we've got to deal with. But we can see and understand what the next 25 years looks like in terms of our investment and the challenges that we're going to face and the investment we need to make. And I really see it as a spectrum, so that, in 25 years' time, I'd love to be doing all green, but that hybrid relationship is going to incrementally move forward. And I think the advanced WINUP funding enables us to really kickstart that, and so that we'll be doing much more green infrastructure as we go forward. One of the stats that we often use is that there's a big skyscraper in Manchester called the Beetham Tower.
Ah, yes.
And if we were to stop all the flooding and to reduce the CSO spills to meet our environmental targets, then we would need to build 35 of those towers underground in order to meet that challenge. We can't do that. There is not space to do that. We couldn't afford to do it. So it's a real impetus, I think, to say actually it's absolutely right. We have to have some grey infrastructure, but we have to supplement it with the green.
Yeah, and how do you get the engineers who often say, well, we can't model, nature, and it's not as predictable as those concrete pipes, and thus on this hybrid scale, I want 90% of it to be, for the grey. How do you provide the arguments for them to believe, actually, we can do some modeling. We can start providing you some data. We can start pulling in data, from the Wyre, from the Petteril, and from maybe others, to bring you more confidence. How do you have that conversation internally to help move, I guess, not quite a 50-50, but a true hybrid solution?
Yeah, I think it's been really important that as we've sort of started to deliver lots of different case studies, that we are working quite closely with academia.
Okay.
And so that we're understanding the success of the different interventions. So one of the things that we've recently done is we've delivered quite a lot of sustainable drainage in Altrincham, which is a suburb of Manchester. And actually, water companies contributed quite a small amount to that. We're, I think, less than 5% of the sort of the financial contribution. The rest is being done by the local authority. But we've got academic partners that work alongside us, so that actually when we're putting in tree pits or sustainable drainage, we're understanding how effective they are, and all of that is creating a bank of knowledge that we can then use as part of our sort of design work. And I think it's a lot of sort of change is happening generally in this sort of sector around, different companies are experimenting with green solutions. The Environment Agency itself is doing the same. So actually our supply chain is starting to change, and we're starting to see there's a pull from the supply chain to think differently as well. So it will take time. We do really need the regulatory environment to be a little bit more adaptable, so that our regulators are holding us to account to deliver an improvement of X by Y, and if we could soften that a little bit more, so that we can have a best endeavours approach, that if it isn't entirely successful, we can go again at trying to sort of resolve issues within a catchment. That would be really helpful. But there are some big innovation projects that are happening at the moment. So one's called Mainstreaming Nature-Based Solutions. So we're working collaboratively with the Rivers Trust and all the other water companies, the Environment Agency, and lots of different organisations like the NFU and the Country Landowners Association, to actually look at, what's the bank of knowledge we have, how can we make sure that we're collecting all of that together and getting rid of all of those barriers for the future. So those innovation projects are really, really important.
100%. I'm aware of it. I think it was an Off-White grant, that supported this initiative. And I'm wondering, is there also an element that climate change is putting such amount of pressure on grey infrastructure itself that we're seeing its limitations in a way of what it can deliver? I mean, the Bridgewater Canal collapse, for example, could be an example where grey infrastructure needs to be rethought about, and that we need to look at, as you said, some of the green to kind of reinforce it. I don't know if you want perhaps share a view on that, and did the Bridgewater Canal collapse have an impact if you think in terms of that thinking?
I think the Bridgewater Canal example is quite a hard one, really, because the Bridgewater Canal was one of the oldest canals in the country.
Right.
And it was built in the 1700s, famously with no locks. So it takes a very, very sort of tortuous route from the centre of Manchester to the River Weaver because it doesn't have any locks. So it's maybe a difficult example, but I suppose time will tell what caused the collapse. But there was a lot of flooding already in the area, and potentially it might have been undermined by that flooding. We don't know at this stage. But I suppose it comes back to the nearby river flooded, which is the River Bollin, and how could we have stopped the river flooding, which then has had a detrimental impact potentially on that infrastructure. And the River Bollin, again, is a river in Greater Manchester that rises in the Peak District. It flows around the south of Greater Manchester. And interestingly, it flows through several National Trust properties and over National Trust land. So we're doing a lot of work with National Trust, looking at how we can have natural sort of flood management interventions within the catchment to actually sort of better manage and restore the river as it flows from the Peak District. So I think with all of these examples, it's a blend, isn't it, of actually how do we use nature to make us more resilient, to prevent issues with infrastructure being sort of realised.
So let's move away from infrastructure and let's move towards communities and local communities. So you have your catchment system thinking approach. Could you tell us a little bit about it and what you think are some of the learnings from that approach also?
Yeah, so catchment systems thinking was just a sort of a title really that we sort of gave to our strategy of trying to get rid of the silos that exist, not in between organisations, but even within organisations. So in water companies, we're still guilty of thinking about water quality and water quantity and flooding in silos within our own organisations. So we developed at UU this sort of catchment systems thinking philosophy that actually we can only provide resilient services into the future if we do really think about these things together. And so that it sounds very simple, but when organisations have developed over a long time, getting people whose only job is to think about water resources and making sure people have got resilient supplies to drink, to get them to even talk to the people who think about flooding and wastewater treatment, that in itself is sometimes a big leap. So we've really just sort of set about trying to break down all of those internal barriers. And one of the ways that we did that was by creating some new roles, which we sort of call our place-based planning team. And so the whole sort of remit of that team is to work really closely with different stakeholders within a place, bring together our internal thinking from a water company perspective, but also to reach out and to look to work with regulators, with local authorities, with communities, to think about how we can do things differently within a catchment.
Yeah, and did you find that for the success of this kind of catchment-wide project, like you mentioned, in both in the Wyre but also in the Petteril project, that you have to engage with those local communities, and that engaging with them, whilst may have some challenges, also ensures the longevity of the project. And I just wanted to get some of your insights about what are some of the top tips to engage with those local communities for the success of a project at a catchment-wide level.
I think you absolutely need to do that. And I think hopefully by delivering green infrastructure, you're delivering, much wider benefits to a community. You're creating green spaces for them to enjoy. You're, potentially improving air quality. You're just visually improving an area and driving economic benefit from that, and obviously reducing the risks that they may have been experiencing around flooding, or improving the water quality. So trying to translate what those benefits are and explain them to communities and take them along that journey is really, really critical. And I suppose one of the things that we're sort of particularly trying to sort of focus on is this relationship with transport. And, Greater Manchester has got ambitions to, create a much more sustainable approach to transport, including cycleways and bus lanes. And so we're trying to sort of jump on the back of that and say, actually, let's deliver sustainable drainage and, look at how we sort of create much more visually appealing places that manage water in a better way. So, absolutely working with the local community to be able to show and demonstrate the benefits that they all see and to try and sort of overcome the risks that they might perceive, because people also often tend to want the surety of an engineered solution. So I think it's trying to sort of bring that together, and really again using advocates. It's realizing that all sort of authorities and organisations and private companies are sort of treated with a level of mistrust, but actually community groups, local charities, environmental organisations are much more embedded in the community and have a much better way of an experience of being able to deliver with people.
Now let's play a little bit of science fiction, and let's imagine we got a time machine and I could take you into the future. And let's say we can jump 10 or 20 years into the future. What would you want to be able to see on how the water sector has perhaps embraced nature-based solutions, and how do you see nature-based solutions to be part of standard practice in the water sector in 10, 20 years' time? Could you tell us what that future could look like?
Well, I think, the philosophy has to be that, rainwater is the most precious thing that we have. And, that it is absolutely fundamental to the way a water company works. And so we have got to really treasure and value every drop that falls, collect it, protect it, and ensure that we've got resilient catchments so that we can deal with the vagaries of climate change. And that then allows us also to be able to really sort of collect and treat our wastewater in the way that we want to, be able to discharge it back into the natural environment. And protecting that water cycle is absolutely critical. And nature can play a part in every step of that. And I think, in 30 years' time, hopefully in 10 years' time, I would love to be able to sort of say that actually when we understand what our business plan is going to be for that period, that we are first of all going to nature-based solutions and not to concrete. That we are always working in collaboration with the local authorities and the Environment Agency. And what results are places that are greener and bluer and more sustainable and better to live in, and delivering higher quality of life for people than we see today. And I think the thing that we haven't really truly engaged yet is the private sector. We've got some great examples of the work we did with Nestlé, or the work that we've sort of started with the insurance sector. But actually that should be the norm, shouldn't it? That all organisations are valuing water and contributing to how we make a place better in terms of managing that water.
I completely agree. And for that future, what are the kind of skill sets or new jobs do you think we need to start training and preparing for in the water sector to be able to reach that future?
I think there's a shift from traditional civil engineering to nature-based engineering. So the softer skills that need to go with that. You've obviously got to have an understanding of soils and hydrology and all of those things that mean these are sort of landscapes that you're creating. So they're not without a level of engineering, but it's got to be softer, and it's got to really sort of you've got to have people who have practiced in developing ecosystems, and so the sort of softer, greener side, lots more ecologists and environmentalists and horticulturalists and landscape engineers, and all of these people who play a part in actually creating this new wonderful watery landscape we want to create.
And if there is such a thing as a nature-based solution rock star, someone that is outside United Utilities, is doing groundbreaking work, who is that person? or persons that comes to mind?
I think there are a couple of people who come to mind, and many who we've worked with along the journey. I mean, I've talked about the Rivers Trust. There's a lady called Amina Abubakar who works for the Rivers Trust. She did formerly work for United Utilities, but she doesn't now. So hopefully I'm allowed her
Yes.
as my nature-based rock star. But she's really leading the thinking that the Rivers Trust are doing around nature-based solutions and the opportunity that delivers to improve water quality and quantity. Her thinking was really sort of critical to some of the projects that we got off the ground. And she's now leading the Mainstreaming Nature-Based Solutions project, which is the Ofwat Innovations project. Dan Turner, who also works for the Rivers Trust, was absolutely fundamental in getting the Wyre NFM project off the ground. And then looking outside the Rivers Trust, Guy Thompson, who manages Entrade and was formerly of Wessex Water and Natural England. He's a real advocate of nature-based solutions and thinking differently about the financing of it too. So, there are lots of people who are working away, badgering different organisations and trying to make a difference. But those are three that come to mind.
Excellent. So perhaps in addition to those three, who would you like us to invite as our next guest onto Rebalancers podcast? If you could choose anyone, who would you want? Give me two names of individuals you'd like for us to interview on our podcast.
Oh, that's a challenging question.
And David Attenborough has already been mentioned, so you're not allowed to use his name.
I think, we've really got to sort of drive change with our regulators. And so one person who I think, we really need to understand their philosophy and how they're sort of thinking and how they see the future is Helen Wakeham.
Okay.
So Helen Wakeham is one of the directors at the Environment Agency based in the Land and Water team. And she's really critical to us enabling change within the sector. So she would be one. And then I wonder about it's maybe Sir John Cunliffe.
Okay.
So John is leading the review into the water industry. He's looking at where we can make changes across the sector, not just with companies but with regulators, with government, and I think he's starting to pick up on this sort of aspect of we're not really properly planning for water, and nature could play a key role in that. So I think it'd be brilliant if you could interview John Cunliffe.
Amazing. John, Helen, I'm coming. Joe, it's been a real pleasure having you on the podcast, and I look forward to following your journey and some of the amazing work you guys are doing.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Much.